Welcome to Spiritual Studies Session 26. Today, the focus is on the Celtic in all their proportions, meaning Celtic paganism, Celtic folklore, who the Celts are, the Druids, different deities, and the many holidays that we can harken back to Celtic practices and its relationship with neo-paganism. So the talk that I'm giving on this in particular is touching the wide stretch that Celtic religion, folklore, history can offer. There are many subjects that I'm going to touch on that require more specification, more research to go in and focus on. This is just acquainting with the many mysterious and known aspects of the Celts. So, first off, to start on several context and historical notes to kind of set the air of the discussion. The Celts are, when I say the Celts, I'm referencing the Gaels, the Britons, the Gauls, and the Galatians, and many other subsequent tribes, Ireland included. This is a grouping of people whose main connection is a mutual language. So to group them all together in certain ways is unfair. This is a very general mix of people in the ancient world. They, as a collective group, however, were master craftsmen. They were known in the ancient time for crafting iron. They created the first iron swords, as opposed to what history had always made, which were more ragged bronze swords. They invented chainmail. They actually have been shown to have built superior roads to the Romans and were very, very wealthy for their time. They really had a tremendous amount of resource and trade that benefited them as a collective people. Now, when it comes to speaking of the deities of the Celtic Pantheon, there is a wide variety. Essentially, there are a few deities that are known throughout all the regions, that the names have been shared throughout all the regions. And there are several local deities. And by local, it's this phenomena that a specific mountain has a deity. They're called topographical spirits. A specific town has a deity, like the town of Vaison has Vasio, or you have Vasigus, which is the spirit of the mountains over the town of Vasquez. So in the Celtic religion, you have several deities that are extremely a local know-how, extremely characteristic only to the people that live there. But as mentioned before, there are ones that we're going to be discussing much later in this talk that are ubiquitous across the many Celtic tribes. A lot of what we know about the Celts is by virtue of Roman conquest. The Celts did not write much down, which I'll get to in a second, but when the Romans were traveling through, spying, doing such things, Caesar is the one that wrote a lot of the information that we're referring to, especially about the Druids. But they noticed that there was a lot of syncretism between the gods that the Romans worshipped at this time and the gods that the Celts worshipped. And we'll get into that more later. Now, when it comes to not writing things down, it has a lot to do with the Druids. The Druids, in this way, were the keepers of the knowledge, being that it was spoken it was spoken knowledge. It was passed through mnemonics. It was not written. And I'm going to make a guess or a judgment call, or call it an educated guess here. We'll touch on it a bit later, but the Druids had a very high reverence of trees. And what do you write things on? Oh, you write them on paper or papyrus, right? Which would include or necessitate the cutting down of trees, right? So I would say that maybe it was a type of spiritual taboo that they kept a secret, that they never wrote it down. It was forbidden to write it down, which is to the detriment of historians now, right? Another way to justify this is that the Druids, you could say, as a priestly class, as a secret society of sorts, hidden knowledge and so forth, the idea would be to keep it amongst the ranks, to not let it disseminate, lest it be misunderstood. So the idea of secret doctrines could easily justify why we don't have written sources on this topic, right? So everything that we refer to about the Druids and about a lot of what the Celts believed and what they did is written by people reacting to them. So we will probably never know the exact traditions, the exact extent, the exact deities, the exact interpretations. So this isn't to say, I'm not just saying I have nothing to talk about here. This is just to say that there is a lot of mystery about the Celtic people. There's still a lot yet that we have to say, but to say hard and fast that we know, that we know the Celts is really an egregious overstep. So I'm going to start by saying, or talking about, two different folklores that can explain some of the culture that we've inherited in the modern day. The first folklore that I want to speak on is this cat Sith. And notice the use of the word Sith, right? For all of you Star Wars fans, you can find the etymology here in Celtic. But a cat Sith was a black cat with a kind of white or maybe gray patch in its chest. It was interpreted as not a fairy, which we've discussed in this course before, but a witch that could transform into the cat 9 times. The reason why they were associated with the witches, I would hearken another guess, would be the very thought of them seeing cats commonly around witches, which, by the way, when I say witches throughout this whole thing, this is not negative. This is positive. This is a natural knowledge that is an earned title. I mean, look at the Old English definition of witch if you really want to get into it. But the idea is that the witch could transform into the cat 9 times. And why 9 times? Well, there is an obsession among the Celts with the number 3, which we see all across the Western tradition, but especially so in the Celts. And what is 3 times 3? Just an idea. But the idea here is that the cat Sith, or the witch that would transform into the cat Sith, if pressed to transform into the cat a 10th time, would forever remain a cat. And this, as you can assume, was why later on we say that a cat has 9 lives. The cat Sith, in particular, is a Scottish wildcat which breeded with domestic cats. And this created this kind of hybrid. They're called Kellas cats. Kellas, Kellas cats. And for whatever reason, there's a big superstition about them. So they didn't trust them, especially the Scottish did not trust the cat Siths. They didn't trust these breeds of cats. They claimed that they would steal a person's soul um, before it was claimed by the gods. So they were very serious about not letting these cats around corpses. They would perform these watches, which we can refer to as a late wake. The Fil Fadalach, which were these times where they would hang around the bodies night and day to make sure that a cat Sith wasn't anywhere near the corpse before they buried it. So they would go and create several distractions. For instance, they would leap around and wrestle and would put out catnip, would play music. They would do all sorts of these weird things to distract the cats to get them away from the bodies. And during Halloween or on Samhain, they would put out a saucer of milk outside of every house for the cat Sith, so that it would basically keep busy. And if they didn't put out the milk, the superstition was that all the cow's milk would run dry that year. So there's an explanation of several cultural idiosyncrasies that we've still inherited. 9 lives, cats, and the other one, the other folklore I want to touch on is the old Celtic vampire myth. It's centered around a character, Abertach. And Abertach was this tyrant, essentially. He was a terrible ruler who was also a sorcerer, a very notable sorcerer. They described him as a short, dwarfish man of many tellings, also claiming that he had a sort of physical deformity. And he was a very jealous man, and I think the story goes that he was trying to catch his wife in the act of cheating, but he slipped and fell to his death. And since Abertach was a leader, the traditional thing would be to bury a king or a noble person standing upright in the grave. That would be a way of honoring their position. However, they found that Abertach returned, and he, post-mortem, and was demanding that people would cut their wrists and feed him with their blood by putting it into a bowl to sustain him. So you can see the vampiric implications here already. So they did it because they were fearful of Abertach in life, and they're fearful of him in death. However, eventually they got sick of this, as you do with tyrants, and so they hired an assassin to kill him. And even though he was killed, he would keep coming back. I think they hired an assassin 3 times, actually twice over, killed him twice more, and each time he would come back demanding blood from the people. And then after several, failed attempts, a druid came and said that he knew what to do about this creature. The idea here is that he's I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but a Morpio, which is a kind of Gaelic vampire. And the idea here is that vampires can only be created through magic. And they do achieve a sort of immortality. So you can't destroy them, but you can trap them. So the idea was to make a sword out of wood, out of yew wood. And again, sacred wood, sacred trees. The yew would be a binder. It would bind this creature. And this is where we get the old wooden stake into the heart, right? And this would weaken the vampire, Abertach, and then would bury him upside down in the grave, cover it with ash branches and thorns. So again, more use of wood magic. And then on top of that all, a large boulder. And so, you can still go to this site and, that this vampire is not dead, but just trapped eternally in this kind of tomb. So there's some kind of folklore that gives us some understanding of our kind of paranormal, vampires, cats, Halloween sort of vibes, right? And speaking of Halloween, we have to pay credo to its origination, right? Where Halloween really comes from before the days of appropriation. And I gotta say, the Celts are the kind of center of ancient world holy days, not holidays, but holy days. And they're all centered around astrological times. But anyhow, I'm going to get to that later. I'm going to go through and focus right here on Halloween, or as they call it, Samhain. And we find evidence of Samhain being practiced since the Neolithic, at the very least, that all of these ancient temples, these ancient sites, are aligned with the sunrise at Samhain. Um, there was tremendous gatherings, feasts, where they would open up these burial mounds, these tombs, because it was the day where there were portals to the other world, which we're going to talk about the afterlife later. But there's also literature that would say that Samhain, was full of bonfires and sacrifices, which we'll also talk about sacrifices later. But this is to say that this was a very big ritual that would happen back when, that many people would gather, do many different cultural practices. So big deal. The Day of the Dead, really. And this survives in many other traditions outside of the Celtic, right? The Day of the Dead, the day where the dead are nearest to the living, where they honor the dead. One of the many things that they would do would involve apples and hazelnuts. These are sacred foods, often used for divination. And in Celtic mythology, apples are strongly associated with the other world, death, or immortality as well. So, there's the whole Snow White allegory, right? And an interesting lead to why the apple was made the fruit of the Garden of Eden, right? And hazelnuts are, I guess we've kind of forgotten about that culturally, were associated with divine wisdom. So when it comes to the apples, this is where we get apple bobbing from, except it doesn't take the form that we know it today. They would hang an apple from a wooden rod, and on the other side of that wooden rod, they would hang a lit candle. And so they would kind of spin it. They would spin both. And one would try to catch the apple in their teeth on this spinning rod from the tree. Similarly, apples were peeled in one long strip, and when it was tossed, it would give the first letter of one's future spouse's name. So a lot of divination happening, which, mind you, on the day where the other world is nearest, synchronicities, active divinations would be at their most powerful. So this is why we are seeing so many divinatory acts taking place on Samhain, on Halloween. With the hazelnuts, they would put the name of a person that you favored on one, and then your name on another. And you would put those two hazelnuts in a fire or near it. And if the hazelnuts jumped away from the heat, then it was a no-go. No way. But if they roasted quietly, then the divination would say that this is a good match and that this will happen. So accordingly, this is the time to both perform acts of divination, get together, and honor the dead. And in honoring the dead, this is the most fitting time to do so. Astrologically speaking, Scorpio is always been associated with death in this way, and it's the onset of Scorpio. So they would honor this so diligently that they would have place settings at dinner tables for the dead. they would, and again, you know, putting the milk outside of the front of the house to keep the cat siths distracted. Um, and when it comes to this trick-or-treating thing, um, this is literally the act of what used to be called geysers, like a guise, you know, like a charade, where children or whoever would personify the old spirits in exchange for good fortune. So people in masks and costumes originate from impersonating the dead, impersonating those who were dead. So you can imagine that they're dressing up like dead people that they knew. And this is the kind of scariness of it. Now it's been completely blown up, right? People can dress like anything. But the original idea here was to honor the dead by embodying them. And so the trick-or-treating was one of two things. It was honoring the dead by collecting food for the feast on Samhain, right? Or to provide an offering to the dead. And you see this in many traditions, like at sweat lodges here with Native Americans. You'll see that they often will put out the food, a plate of the food for the spirits as well, as a respecting measure of their presence and their welcomeness. So how far Halloween has fallen from its roots, right? So many different festivals, many different gatherings would take on different traditions, different flavors, right? I've noted before how various the Celtic culture is in truth. However, when it comes to the neo-pagans and neo-pagans bringing back Samhain, this seems to be an act of cherry-picking certain locales, certain traditions, and it depends. It variates on how the modern Samhain is practiced, whether by the Wiccan or by other neo-pagan groups, covens, what have you. But it is, no matter what, a big part of the Celts or the neo-pagans, what have you, right? And it comes to celebrating either on October 31st all the way until November 1st, right? Or if it's a group that especially wants to honor the astrological significance, then we're talking about the 6th and 7th uh, of November. So much so that, you know, you're going to change the times to the southern hemisphere, which would put Samhain on April 1st, or no, April 30th to May 1st. So, you know, pick your references here. Are we doing what is traditionally the day, or are we staying true to the astronomical midpoint between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice, which is effectively, you know, what it's all about? If staying true to the old tradition. And in this whole thing about, you know, we're not worshiping but honoring the dead, right? That the sun's annual death and rebirth cycle is well on its way, which will eventually die in what is coming next, the next of 8 festivals, which would be Yule, which is where the sun will die, astronomically speaking. But as we've discussed in the course before, you know, Christianity would literalize this and say, you know, the birth of Christ, right? The birthday of the sun, which is true. It's the birth and death of the sun, you know, like the one with the light, right? Gosh, I'm not going to get into that right now. But anyhow, Yule, also known as Brumalia, Saturnalia, or midwinter, or the winter solstice, has been well celebrated since at least the late Stone Age. You see ancient megalithic sites in both Stonehenge and Newgrange, which completely exemplify this, the honoring of the solstice. Now, I'm not going to get into any of these next holidays nearly as much as I got into Samhain. It's just to give the full smorgasbord of where we're inheriting these holidays from and how they're rooted in the Celts. And I'm not saying the Celts are the ones alone that created all of these. I'm just saying that they are the catalyst, or the gatherers, or the ones that were staying true to the tradition of all of these holidays. So in Yule, you know, there were sacrificial offerings, there was feasting, and there was a number of associative herbs that would go along with it. Holly, mistletoe, yew, again, wood, right? Pine and ivy. All of these things would be associative with the other world and the decorations of celebrating new life. And so the one that survived most especially, right, is the mistletoe. And we can thank the Celts for this one. Also the wreaths, you know, this all comes from the Celts and the midwinter festivities. Next up in line is Imbulk, which is also known as Candlemas, or Disselblad, which is the 1st of February, traditionally marking the first coming back of spring. This is associated with Groundhog's Day. So again, you know, all these holidays, bring it back to the Celts, right? And in Rome, this was a holiday for the shepherds. But, you know, and also in with the Celts, we have this birthing of the spring lambs, you know. Oh, the lamb, huh? This, to the Celts, would be especially dedicated to the goddess Brigid, which we're going to bring up later. So this is also another one of those celebrations, festivities that is being brought back by the reclaiming tradition of the Dionic Wiccans or what have you. The next one up would be the Spring Equinox, or what was called Austera, which is also Liberalia and Hilaria. And this name, Austera, is a dedicated day to the goddess Estre, or Eostre. Austera meaning the vernal equinox. And so here's another celebration, right? And this is the beginning of getting away from the grips of winter. Then you have Beltane, which is another one of these really big celebrations. This is also known as May Day, which is its appropriated name, or Floralia, or Walpurgis Night. And so this is the celebration of flowers, or the festival of Flora, the Roman goddess of flowers. You see that this is where we originally are getting the maypole and the designating of the Queen of May. So for those that have seen Midsommar, it's not about Midsommar. These things didn't happen in midsummer. They happened in May, on May Day, on Beltane. So it's that movie is a kind of mixing of the two traditions. The one that's next is the summer solstice, or Litha, or midsummer, or the summer solstice, right? And this is the turning point where the sun reaches its height and shines the longest of the whole year. Again, all astrological events. So the sun's at its greatest strength, and the celebration of this holiday. So on this time, it would be especially notable to bring out the plants that are associated as solar plants with solar deities, and to honor any solar gods, right? This traditionally by the Druids would be celebrated at Stonehenge itself. And next and lastly is Lammas, or Lunasda, which is also associated with Mabon. No. It's between Mabon and Samhain. It's associated with the Celtic deity Lu, which we're going to get into later. But this is the autumn equinox before the full-on Samhain festival. So these are the 8, count them, 8 different points of the circular year. And all of these celebrations have a rooting in astrological events, times, that this is the only time, this is the holy day. And so, although some of these events would be held as more important than the others, for instance, May Day versus, May Day and Halloween would be the big ones, right? But all of these would be treasured in their own way. And when it comes to our modern day holidays, keep in mind that they are rooted in the pagan, and Christianization would appropriate these holidays to make the transition seem more seamless to the people that were being appropriated. So there's my acknowledgement of the festivals, the holy days. Many of these are being brought back by the Wiccan and neo-pagan societies. So that's what they're rooted in. Exact traditions of all of those days you can dig into more. There is a lot of mystery to be had, but we're going to move on. And the search for a creation story in Celtic paganism is a kind of tricky notion. I do have one that you can interpret as a creation story. Again, we're getting these folklores, these stories after the fact, right? When they were written after the cults, passing through the oral tradition. So some variance and some grain of saltness needs to be, given. But here is a story. In a time before there were no gods and no man, there was the sea. And where the sea met the land, there was a mare that was born or formed from sea foam. We're going to come back to that later. Her name was Aocha. And from there was found an oak tree that grew in the land that sprouted a plant. This is where Aocha gave birth to the first god, Serenos, which we're also going to touch on later. These two got together in classic creation story fashion and begot more gods. And all the gods were born, but they felt lonely because they had no one to worship them or anyone to command. So from the wood of that same oak tree, again, sacredness of the tree of life, ? They created the first man and woman and all other animals, giants included. And soon, though, Aocha felt tired of the land and wished to return, being that she was made of sea foam. So she returned to the sea, where she was transformed into Tethra, or Tethys. Do you hear, do you hear the resemblance here? Tethra, Tetra, Gaia. Oh, the Mother Earth, the Mother Goddess. Tethra, in this tradition, is the goddess of the deep water. Interesting, deep water, the cosmological deep water. If you keeping up on this course, this is the significance of this reference. So the whole sea foam thing in Greek mythology, from Aphros, mixed with the blood from Uranus's genitalia, which birthed Aphrodite, or the goddess of beauty, love, and sex, known as surfing on the pillow of foam. So this tradition of sea foam birthing the goddess not only goes back to the Greek, but also to the Incas. And in Inca, their creator deity, in the pre-Inca, Viracocha, translates as the foam or the fat of the sea. So this tradition of the goddess being born from the sea foam seems to have a pre-societal origination. So the Celts seem to have held on to this and held true to this for a very long time. The sea foam is this idea of emergence or transition between the world of the sea and the world of land. So when something is born, it's emerging from the other world into our world, right? where two worlds meet. And here's the idea, right? From incorporeal nature into corporeal nature. And likewise with death. So you can see the kind of metaphysics. We're just now getting into the metaphysics of the Celts, right? So before anything in myths is always about the primeval abyss, or the prima materia, or the ether, or the cosmic pulp, or the primordial soup, or chaos, you know, the infinite expanse of water, or what we now call space. So this is deep stuff, right? Originator deities always coming from the abyss. That's something boiled over, a stirring from the abyss. Sounds, the word, vibrations, or like by the Aboriginals, where the dreams come from. So in this way too, I want to pay attention to the fact that the Celts, the gods of the Celts, created man, created animals, created all this because they were lonely and they had no one to worship them. So this is a very different dynamic, right? So it's kind of like the Egyptians, where humanity has an integral part, has a belonging with, and a tremendous respect for the gods. There's a mutualism. They're not fighting, they're not lording over, they're mutually included, which would explain why, as I'll go into later, the Celts were so easily would meet death. They had a fundamental trust of death, of birth and death, and what that necessitates. There was no question. And so the gods include man. This is something that I think even the Christians would be envious of. I mean, take a Christian, tell them that they're going to heaven, and then tell them to take a leap, there still would be this hesitance. The Celts had no hesitance. They were utterly of the natural world, completely of nature, formed by and ever returning to nature, or the primordial goddess. Now, here's the time where I'm going to touch on the deities, or the gods, that seem to go throughout all the different tribes of all the different peoples that are put under the umbrella term Celtic. And one of them was this head honcho. I'm going to do 3 male and 3 female. The head honcho here is Dagdah, or referred to as the Dagdah, and that's the master of magic and mysticism, meaning the good, or the great god, mastery over many skills. This name is coming from Proto-Indo-European and is rooted in the word meaning shining divinity, or literally shining, like the daytime, the good. This name is also the names that are shared, Eochad Olethar, meaning the horseman or the all-father, the fair Ben, which is the horned man, the Rod Rafessa, meaning the lord of great knowledge, or the De'er, which is the fertile one, or Circe, meaning the striker. Many names to associate. So the Dagdah is synonymous with Odin of the Nordic tradition, or say Zeus, very much more loosely of the Greek tradition. The Dagdah had several different relics, one being the cauldron that could produce a bountiful feast at will, the cauldron being a very synonymous object with the Celtic culture, very mysterious, not substance, symbol of the Celtic culture. Also had a mighty club that possessed 2 different powers, one that could slay 9 men in a single swing, again, 9, 3 times 3, and could also revive someone slain with a single touch. This is like the Staff of Mercury. Then you also have this harp made of oak, and the harp is the song that would command the wills and emotions of men and would put the seasons in their proper order. So the seasons were a song played by the Dagdah. So this is kind of like the Hierophant or the high magician. So tarot is rooted in this as well. Next, we'll move on to the one that I mentioned before is Serenos. Serenos is a mysterious god. There's very little information to discern from them. This is the horned god, which gives a lot of kind of seemingly ominous vibes to people. So this Serenos seems to be a mediator between man and nature, a literal representation of nature itself, Serenos. So in this way, he is mysterious. What does nature want? What does nature do? When is one in unison with nature, and when is one standing against it? So he could be very beneficent, or potentially, not a good deal for those that don't respect nature, right? And the god of the wilds in this way was kind of retroactively interpreted as potentially a god of creation and fertility. If you remember, we saw that he is the originating god, or was a version of an originating god from the original creation story that I read earlier. So there's not a lot to say other than that Serenos can take on many forms. Could be an elk, could be a snake, a wolf. That he had free reign over all creatures and vegetation, and that the ones that really the essence of Serenos is pristine nature and what might be called uncivilized ways. So the complete transient inclusion of nature in all forms by the people would be a praising of Serenos. And I say this is a very interesting deity, very notable for the modern age. So for those that would go out to hunt, or for those that would go out to gather, to be in good tidings with Serenos would have been very of the utmost importance. And forgive me if I'm moving somewhat quickly through some of them. Again, there's a lot of ambiguity about a lot of them, so I don't want to stretch my neck out on too many of these. The next is Lugh, which is an Irish god of nobility. And I'm going to take a pause here and say for a moment that a lot of these gods and goddesses that you can look into in the Celtic tradition are almost transient with people of the past. You could almost say that there were very famous people that did notable things in the far past that eventually would have them named as legends, and they would cover the legend with mythologies so that the people are not far away from the gods themselves, if you understand what I mean by this. In other ways, it is much more seemingly blatant that they are a god. Yes, I'm saying that's true. But in some cases, you see that it involves a lot more of the human than might be traditionally understood when it comes to a lot of pantheons. Anyhow, Lugh is a master of crafts and a cunning warrior. You see what I'm saying here? And held the spear of us all, which is essentially the spear that can move like lightning. Yeah, I'm getting Zeus vibes here, and would return to who threw it. So in this way, Lugh is a very notable warrior. For what purposes, I can't quite say, but I'm going to reiterate that his holy day was on August 1st, Lunasa. I'm going to move on quickly to Brigid. And this is a big deal. Brigid is a big deal when it comes to the Celts. You could say Brigid, you could say Brig, you could say bride, which, yes, the word bride derives from Brigid, the Proto-Celtic word Brigante, which means the high one or the exalted one. There's a connection with this goddess with sunlight and fire. This could be related to the dawn, could be a dawn goddess. So it's to rise, literally the same root of the word bright, Brigid. Bridget is also the goddess of wells, deep connection to wells in waterways, you know, which kind of ties her to the primordial goddess. She's depicted as a fiery-haired woman in a cloak of a sunbeam, and she appears primarily in the form of a maiden or a mother, but she is a triple goddess. And what do I mean by this? In the last talk I touched on it. I'll reiterate quite quickly. The triple goddess is the maiden, the mother, and the crone. The three different representations of how the woman is analogous to the nature of things, how the moon waxes, wanes, and gets full, how the woman does so in a synonymous fashion, in a poetic fashion, how the woman is tied to nature in this way. So that should be noted, that she can take on many faces, that she can take on many roles and still be Bridget, which is a curious note, right? She is also tasked with the domestication of animals. She protects the domesticated animals. And this harkens back to the primordial goddess topic in the Neolithic, how women cultivated agriculture and how women cultivated animals. So Bridget is a callback to the original social structure of matrilineal societies in the Paleolithic. And so, in referencing when you see the triple goddess or when you see Bridget in these ancient stories, you have to know that she takes on different faces, different names because of this triple goddess designation, which makes her essentially the highest tier, or one of, if not the most highest tier of the pantheon, depending on what Celtic tribe we're referring to. Another notable woman goddess or female goddess is Cerduwen. And Cerduwen is a sorceress, most notably the most, if not one of the most powerful witches in Celtic mythology. She is not necessarily ever really depicted as a maiden. She's depicted as a mother and a crone, so she gets the two other halves. She's not designated as a triple goddess. So the name Ewen is how you find it in Welsh lore, which could be the root of the name Anwen. Cerduwen is a white witch, and here's the distinction: the black witch and the white witch. The white witch does acts of sorcery to help people, as opposed to the black witch. So Cerduwen as a sorceress is a beneficent, altruistic being. Her wisdom as a crone is beneficial to all. She's displayed many times with the gift of shape-shifting, which, as we know, with the mother goddesses, this is a trope amongst all of them. The symbol of Cerduwen is her cauldron, which, like we mentioned before, the cauldron is a big deal with the Celts, and her cauldron is believed to have been the inspiration in the Arthurian myth of the Holy Grail, the seeking of Cerduwen's cauldron. There's many stories that I could touch on here, but again, I'm moving quickly. So I'm going to tie that Cerduwen is tied to the witch goddess Circe in the Greeks, or Hecate, and you could tie her to Baba Yaga in the Slavic mythology. The next up is Morrigan. And Morrigan is the Irish goddess of death and destiny. This is a darker figure named the Phantom Queen. So she offers prophecy. She is the goddess of fate, and she knows everything that will happen. She travels as a conspiracy of ravens carrying the dead to their fates. She is both a single deity and a triple goddess. So many different roles here. The name Morrigan, Mor comes from Proto-Indo-European, meaning terror. This is tied to the word nightmare, nightmare. And Riorgen is meaning queen, which is, you know, the same as the Latin regina, regina meaning queen. So this is Morrigan, the terror queen. And, you know, if she rules death, And in later times, beyond the Celts and into kind of Christian appropriatism times and in the Middle Ages, many malevolent female spirits would be termed Morrigna, named after her. This is ties to that folklore creatures talk that we had, the demon goddess Lilith, the Lamia, you know, anyhow. So her designation as Phantom Queen is a really on-the-nose reference to her relationship with the dead, that you would have to pass through the Morrigan. And so in war, there would be homage to Morrigan. You would always keep Morrigan in mind. And that since she saw the future of all things, if she were to pay people visits before a battle, it could be presumed as a good omen or a bad omen, that you're not going to get out of this battle, that the Morrigan represented by the crow or by the raven is a omen of what is to come, that the raven is, or the crow is speaking as a conduit or a representation or an embodiment of the Morrigan, or the female death figure, the female death fate. So she could be depicted as a shapely woman, she could be depicted as a crone, she could be depicted as a warrior queen, or as a raven. And so this triple goddessness would give her that same sort of ambiguity as Brigid, as I previously mentioned. So briefly, to wrap all these things up and then to give a final analysis, I'm going to speak on the afterlife and I'm going to speak on the Druids. So the afterlife to the Celts here that I've touched on before is that it's all about the other world. And this is the Fae world, or the world of fairy people. And this is always existing alongside us. Here's the metaphysics. I'm giving it to you right now. The other world is hidden from mortal people by strong magic. The other world exists in all kinds of places. The other world could exist in lakes, in forests, in hills, in dunes, in rivers. It could exist in castles. It can appear at night or on Samhain and would vanish in the morning. So you might get a glimpse of the other world. This is how you explain ghosts or apparitions. That there are thin places between the other world and this world. And strangely enough, time is experienced very differently in the other world. A year may have passed in the other world, and centuries could have passed in the real world. This is time dilation. It's kind of like working with dreams. So the people of the other world, those who have moved on to the other world, do not age the same way because of the time dilation as people in this world, and can seem to remain forever young or immortal. And this is why the fairies in these old folklores seem to be immortal. And all of this is to say that the other world is of a different dimensionality and introduces paradox, and that enchanted places are enchanted because they're not far away from the other world in this extra dimensional sense. So I move on to the Druids. And as I mentioned before, word to mouth knowledge, secret knowledge, accolades, you know, they could study for as many as 20 years to earn the title of the Druid. That they were profound in uniting the people of the Celtic culture. If anything united all of these various tribes, it was the Celts and what you might call Druidism. And Caesar says that the center of Druidism was in Britain, which it's no accident that that's where you're finding Stonehenge, right? No wonder it would be centered there. And that the Druids' decisions in cultures were so important that you would be banished from your tribe or community for disobeying them. The Druids would be the ones to settle disputes over boundaries. They were the end-all, be-all. And I want to say Druids comes from the name Andrew comes from Druid. And Druid is Celtic for the knowers of the oak, the tree of knowledge, the tree of life, that oak tree that was at the very center of the creation myth. That this is all tied to the tree thing, the logi, the many branches of knowledge that lead back to the roots of the Druidic order. So why the Druids would use yew, why they would use ash, why they would use oak, all of these trees are sacred, religious, pre-cosmogenic, can cure both people and animals, are an end-all, be-all tool to all. And the mistletoe amongst the Druids, which, used in the Yule ceremonies, was a sign of the other world. So where you find the mistletoe growing is a sign that this is a thin place, that the other world is not far from here, or it exists here and you may see it at night or on the right kind of day. And they would use this mistletoe to cure poisons, disease, infertility. They would even use it to treat animals. So very sacred. And so accordingly, there were groves that were the ultimate place of ceremonial worship. Groves were the place, the sacred groves that the Christians would burn to get rid of their sacred homes. Groves were where the Druids would dispense their judgment and punishments among crimes that were committed in councils that were gathered. And where there weren't groves, the worship would take place by rivers or streams or lakes, because likewise, the waters, where the waters meet the land, are also sacred places. Again, hearkening back to that creation myth, an Eocha. So water gods are sacred. The water is sacred. You must honor the water. So one of two places, right? The groves, or where the water meets the land. And I'm going to touch on now that this depiction of human sacrifices. So in this way, as I noted, in the many ceremonies in Beltane or what have you, these sacrifices were voluntary. And they were voluntary because of this utter trust of the afterlife that I'm telling you about. And I'm not saying, hey guys, hey, let's all get at, let's get back at it, right? I'm saying that this is a very different cultural context. That the idea of the other world is so known, not believed, known to them, that a sacrifice would be welcomed. That Celtic men, when captured in battle, would ask for their throats to be cut so that they could follow their leaders into death and live with them in the other world. There was no doubt. And this was what made them ruthless warriors, that made them do anything in pursuit of a cause, because they knew. There was no distrust. So the sacrifice thing, we might need to turn a different kind of eye to. And in Christian appropriation, it's not just the Canaanites, but also the Celts that they depicted as these tremendously savage, sacrificial people. And I'm going to just say that it's not that sacrifice didn't happen. It's just that there were very different cultural contexts to this. And to approach this with terror, and to approach this as this nightmarish, unga bunga, primeval, what is happening, this is not a fair lens to look at this. So in this, though, I want to iterate that the Druids were tremendously sophisticated in art, in learning, in moral judgments. They were tremendously learned people. They had an esoteric tradition that we can only speculate over. And that they were the ones that held the knowledge of how to conduct ceremonies. to specific gods, how to honor nature, how to look for specific plants, what they're used for, and that women, and here's the big note, women were also Druids. Women were not excluded from the priestly order. And here's where things get blown up quite a bit. There was homosexuality of both men and women in Celtic culture. And this was not taboo. That they attached no shame in same sexual relations. And if rejected, they felt insulted, as if they're, it's kind of an attack on your vanity, right? Your pride. And that women could hold high respect in these cultures, along with the goddess mythos that I was talking before. And in the last talk, I talked about how the Celts were the last kind of vestige of the goddess movement and of the Paleolithic goddess religion that was destroyed throughout the ages. And in this way, it's not to say that the Celts weren't patriarchal in different ways, but that women had a respectable role both in goddess and in societal function, and that women that had children were greatly respected and earned high status amongst the people. And that, it was so homosexuality, equal rights, none of this was taboo to the Celts. So in all these depictions of them being savage, especially in film, is all because the Romans won. Their depictions of being savage and their depictions of being brute, remorseless creatures of a lack of sophistication is historical appropriation. That there were equal rights, that there was free love, that there was a sophisticated mythology that goes a lot deeper than one might assume on the outside, that there was an honoring of festival of all manner of astrological events, an inherited tradition that bleeds all the way back to the Stone Age, that people don't know where they got this knowledge from. And I'm hinting to you this whole time about where they got this knowledge from. And that there's a lot more to uncover about the Celts in this way. Mystery be had, but in the many traditions that we now have, our holidays, our superstitions, we owe this, and we can find its root and its original meanings in honoring how the Celts understood it.